Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We are so excited to have Amy Meyerson joining us tonight. Hello, Amy. Her new
Hi.
book, The Imperfects, came out May 5th. It is on our staff picks list. It's a perfect book club book, and we encourage you to buy it and read it. If you would like to purchase it from the Doylestown Bookshop, there is a button that says Purchase the Author's Books here on your screen. You can click that, and it'll take you right to our website where you can check out her books and buy them if you'd like to. Also, if you would like to ask the author questions, you may do so in the chat box on the right of your screen. And then at the bottom of your screen, there's an Ask a Question field. You can click that and ask your questions in there. After I'm done talking with Amy, I'll then go through your questions. Amy Meyerson is the best-selling author of the Bookshop of Yesterdays, which was also fantastic. We were so happy to be able to have her at our store when that came out. And in lieu of an in-person event, we have her with us here tonight. So welcome, Amy.
Thanks.
We're very happy to have you.
Looking forward to returning to your store in person again sometime.
It'll be a great day when we can have our in-person events, for sure. But in the meantime, this is what we've got. So I'll start off by asking you to talk about The Imperfects and your inspiration for writing it.
Sure. Yeah. So I have my book, so I'll just hold it up so people can see what it looks like. The Imperfects is about the Miller family. Oh, all of a sudden only my face is on the screen. Okay. It's about the Miller family, who are a pretty dysfunctional bunch. And at the beginning of the novel, they convene at their grandmother's house for the first time in 6 years to sit Shiva after she's passed away. So while they're at her house, one of them discovers this brooch that their grandmother had. And together they quickly realized that it had something called the Florentine diamond in it. The Florentine diamond is an 137 karat yellow diamond, and it was the premier jewel of the Austrian crown jewels. So when the empire fell, the emperor fled to Switzerland, and he sent all the crown jewels ahead of him. But when he arrived in Switzerland, pretty much everything was there except for the Florentine diamond. And in real life, it's never been seen since. So in the novel, it shows up in the Miller's grandmother's behind her dresser in a brooch. And they have no idea. It's worth about $10 million. And they have no idea how their grandmother had this brooch. So they have to kind of put the pieces together to discover whether or not it's lawfully theirs, because there's several other parties in the book who also lay claim when they find out that the Florentine diamond has reappeared. So in the process of finding out about the diamond, they find a lot about their grandmother and a lot about each other, which kind of enables them to confront their old wounds. So it's a family drama. There's a little bit of mystery in it. There's a lot of history. There's also a lot of gemology, which I love, about diamonds and so forth. So there's also a lot about cultural heritage law as well, which is the law of, deciding who cultural artifacts belong to. So it's got a little bit of everything. I'll put down now.
Okay. And you have an interest in gemology. What that obviously influenced your decision to center the novel around the Florentine diamond. Were there any other factors that went into making that decision?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So for a long time as a hobby, I've made jewelry. I mostly work in silver and with semi-precious stones. But through that, I've really developed an interest in jewelry, like beyond something you wear, as the artistry and the history of it. And I've just loved the idea of how, like other artifacts or objects, it's passed down and it carries a lot of history to it. So for a really long time, I've had an idea that I wanted to write something about a diamond and jewelry in particular. And initially, I wasn't planning on. Initially, I hadn't heard of the Florentine diamond when I first started thinking about this project, and I had thought that maybe I would write about the Romanovs and if there was like a famous Russian diamond. But as I was starting to research that, it didn't really give me the information that I wanted. So I just kind of Googled famous missing gemstones, and the Florentine popped up on all these lists. And when I started to read about it, I realized it had this really, really fascinating history, both the history when we knew where it was, and then the history kind of since it's been missing. So before it belonged to the Habsburgs and the Austrian Empire, it belonged to the Medicis in Italy. I guess when it was a Habsburg heirloom, Marie Antoinette wore it on her wedding day, and Napoleon's second wife wore it, and other people wore it as well. And due to the what happened to a lot of those people who had possession of the diamond, the Habsburgs thought that it was cursed, and so no one wanted to wear it. And then since it's been missing, there's been all of these rumors about what may have happened to the diamond. And so one of the things that sort of interested me about that was that a lot of the worth of this diamond comes from, I mean, the fact that it's missing, but all of not just the known history, but the unknown history as well. So it just felt like a really good venue for a story. And when I started to talk to some experts, I realized that the Florentine diamond wasn't as well known in the jewelry world as I would have expected. The various experts I talked to, they'd kind of vaguely heard of it, but they had to Google it themselves to remember what the Florentine diamond was. So when I heard that, it made me feel like I landed on something special, because it was something that had a really rich and kind of immediate history to it. But it was also something that it seemed like people hadn't really written about before or knew that much about.
Okay. And both of your novels actually center on inheritance. What interests you about that?
Yeah, so, I think it sort of happened accidentally because I wanted to tell these multi-generational family stories and kind of look at how the decisions and the mistakes of the past affect the present. And so it just kind of happened that inheritance was a good way of looking at those generational connections. But I think beyond that, inheritance is really interesting. It's kind of like traveling, where people's true colors often are revealed.
Right.
I spoke to an estate lawyer while I was working on the novel, and she told me that people's often their ugliest sides come out when there's an inheritance. And what I found really interesting about what she said is that when there are the biggest fights over something is when different people in a family have competing values surrounding the inheritance, right? So if a family inherits a house, if one person in the family sees that as their, family home and can't bear to part with it, and as a symbol of memories, that's really different than somebody who sees it as worth X amount of dollars. And so It just, I think that it's because of that, it seemed like inheritance was a way to really get at kind of the heart of what conflicts these characters have with each other.
Mm-hmm. And the novel covers a lot of ground between both world wars, the gemology, which we talked about, and the law. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your research process when you're bringing all of those things together and putting them into one story?
Sure. Yeah. So I knew I did a ton of research for this book, and but I knew when I started out that I kind of needed to know where the book began and where it would end. And so since this diamond went missing at the end of World War I knew that there needed to be some of World War I and Austria in the novel. Helen, the grandmother, she was an Austrian immigrant, and she was Jewish. So that kind of, I felt like if I had to include something about World War II, or that would be skirting kind of a major, a major event in history, in Austrian history. So I knew that there has to be this history in it. And then I was really interested in looking at this diamond in terms of what the diamond itself, how the diamond and the brooch that it's in can kind of hold clues for the Millers to find out about their family's past. And then finally, one of the things that was really interesting for me about writing this, and I was really excited to explore, was when I read about the Florentine diamond, and then I talked to some lawyers. I wasn't exactly sure who, if it resurfaced, it would belong to. So when it went missing, as I was saying before, it was part of the Austrian crown jewels. But there's some debate over whether or not the Austrian crown jewels belong to the Habsburgs as a family, or Austria as a country. And so there's some debate there about it. I think most people between that debate would say it probably belongs to Austria, not the private family. But it was a Medici heirloom before that, and I won't bore anyone with the details of it, but there's a treaty after World War I which said that a lot of these Medici heirlooms that ended up elsewhere belonged to Italy. So one of the things I was really interested in when I sat down to write was that I didn't know who, if this diamond resurfaced, who it would belong to lawfully. And I also wanted to make sure that there was a real case, which I won't spoil, for the Millers perhaps lawfully having the diamond. So I'm sort of long way around, but basically there were a ton of different aspects that I wanted to include and to research in the book. So it involved a ton of work. One of the things that I discovered in writing this book is one of the best ways to research is to talk to experts. So for example, I just by emailing him kind of befriended the historian at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. And he was amazing. Anytime I emailed him a question, he would, in a day or two, I would get this really long answer that I previously would have looked in multiple books to find the answer to, and I couldn't. Wow. So one of the nice things, it's really fun. One of the things that gets me excited to write about stuff is that when I talk to experts in the field, they're really excited to share their expertise. So I kind of collected a bunch of experts from each field. The gemological stuff was really fun. I went to the Gemological Institute of America, and it's in Carlsbad, which is near San Diego, and they set up like a whole day tour for me. The librarian talked to me a lot about mid-century brooches and how to design an authentic brooch that could hold the Florentine diamond that would be the model for Helen's in the novel. I also went to Sotheby's and talked to a jewelry specialist there, and he showed me their magnificent gems collection, which was beautiful. I got to hold a $4 to $5 million diamond. Wow. So it was, it was this mix of in-person research and, more traditional research. And so one of the things that was really fun too is that through all of this, I developed a lot of story points for the book. So I think actually the amount of research I did in the novel helped me to finish it at a quicker pace.
Wow. That must have really been something to hold that kind of gem in your hand.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting about diamonds is the different ways they gain value. So the Florentine diamond, for instance, it's massive. It's 137 carats, but it's actually a pretty ugly diamond. It's a yellow diamond, and it's like a muddy green yellow. So it really gains its value. Well, what the specialist at Sotheby's told me is the diamond itself is worth about $3 million, but with all the history, it would probably sell for about $10 million. And, jewelry is like art or houses where it's only worth as much as somebody's willing to pay for it. But so this diamond that I held at Sotheby's was a perfectly clear diamond. So it was a D grade diamond, and it was beautiful, but it was actually quite small. Or not, it wasn't that small. It was big for a diamond, but it just looked like a crystal to me, and it was sort of teardrop shaped. And so I was surprised at how small it was in my palm relative to the value of it. But that diamond gained all of its value because of what a high quality diamond it was. And for its size, because the bigger diamonds get, the more likely it is they're going to have various imperfections in them.
Wow. And having done all this research and talked to all of the experts you've talked to, what do you think happened to the Florentine diamond, if you had to take an educated guess?
Yes. So there's a lot of theories, and some of them are more wild and exciting than the others. Most likely what has happened to the Florentine diamond, which is what happens to most stolen diamonds, is that it's probably been recut. And it's probably been recut for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a lopsided diamond. It's shield shaped, and it's double rose cut, which is not a very popular cut anymore because it doesn't have a ton of facets. So the way we cut diamonds now is to make them sparkle as much as possible. So back when it was cut in the 17th or 18th century, it was cut to maintain as much size as possible. So to a modern eye, it wouldn't really look that desirable. So that's one reason it was probably cut. But also, the only way you really, so if you recut a diamond, you can't identify it. So a lot of stolen diamonds are recut to mask their identity. Nowadays, when diamonds are graded, they get a little like serial number put into them. So it's actually very difficult to get away with stealing modern diamonds. But certainly with these historic diamonds, they're usually recut so that they can be sold, which, you know, I think in the case of the Florentine is really unfortunate because I think part of what gives it its, at least for me, its interest is this unusual cut and the idea that it's been kind of, you know, it was the Habsburgs didn't recut it. So it sort of, it maintained its history, even though it was put in different pieces over centuries, it's sort of maintained its size and stature for a really long time. So there was, so it's probably been recut for sure. And then I think to me, the theory that seems the most likely is that in the 80s, there was a yellow diamond that went up for sale in Switzerland. And given the size of that yellow diamond and the likelihood that it was probably cut from a larger diamond, people think it was most likely the Florentine diamond. Also, the woman who sold it on behalf of her father, she remembered that when he got it in, I think, the 20s, it had this unusual shape. So there's a lot of evidence that would suggest that that's probably the Florentine diamond. However, since the diamond was sold, people don't know its whereabouts again. So it's still, I don't think it's missing, but it's still kind of hidden. And so what that says to me is that it's probably in a safe somewhere, which is the unfortunate fate of a lot of really valuable historic artwork too. But jewelry is that if it's not in a museum, it's usually tucked away in a safe where no one can really enjoy it.
Right. Oh my goodness. So the novel's told from the perspective of all three Miller siblings and their mother, Deborah. Could you talk a little bit why you decided to structure the story in that way?
Sure. Yeah. So my first novel was first person, and I went back and forth in different drafts over whether or not it should be a close third or a first person. And for that book, it made sense that it was really in Miranda, the main character's perspective. But for this novel, I wanted to be able to get into the heads of all of the main characters. I thought that was really important in terms of so much of their arguments are about perspective and the ways in which they don't understand each other and see different events differently. And so kind of the only way I felt like I could illustrate that was by going through their different points of view. But I decided pretty early on that I didn't want to be too organized or like systematic about how I jumped into their perspectives. So I kind of, you know, there's some scenes in the book where I want everyone's perspective. So I'll have one paragraph for one character and one paragraph for the next character. And that to me is important for those scenes to get everyone's point of view. And then there's other places in the book where there's longer sections that are from one particular character's perspective or their one story. And I did that, I kind of just let it, you know, happen organically. And then when I was editing, if I realized I'd sort of let one character go for a while, I'd make sure to come back to them. But I thought it, you know, worked authentically for this story. One of the things that helped too, in terms of being in the various characters' points of view, is that I wanted to make sure that in addition to this arc and struggle that they have as a family to figure out what happened to their grandmother, that they each had their own narratives and that they each had their own struggles that were kind of independent of the family struggle, but in kind of resolving their issues as a family, they tackle their own issues too. And so to do that, it just seemed to me to make the most sense to have all of these characters' voices in the book. The whole thing is still third person to create some continuity, but it was a lot of fun to get to see the same scene through different characters' perspectives.
Yeah. Do you happen to be working on anything new right now?
I'm just starting on something new. It's a novel about, it's kind of about the history of wine in California as told through a family vineyard through the 20th century. So the book, it doesn't start with Prohibition, but it spans Prohibition to, I think, about 2010 is probably when I'm gonna end. And it's so the plot about it is that it starts in the present, and this family's convening for a family wedding. They have their own conflicts, but while they're at this wedding, they discover some bones buried under the vineyard. And the book kind of goes back in time to tell you, what secrets are kind of literally buried under the vineyard, and kind of how this family came to own this prominent vineyard. So I was really looking forward to doing, which I still hopefully will at some point, some in-person vineyard visits to Santa Ynez and Santa Barbara. But for now, I'm just kind of reading about wine, and drinking wine. But while interesting, is not as interesting as like going and getting to talk to people. So I'm just sort of starting to set up some phone calls with winemakers and grape growers. And I'm really excited to see how that helps the story take shape. But one of the things I've already realized is that in wine, there is an analogy for everything in life.
Really?
Yeah. So it's
that'll be fun diving into that.
Yeah.
So with the Imperfects, what do you hope that readers will take away from this novel?
A bunch of things. One of the things that's really important to me in all of my books is that I want them to be quick reads and page turners, not necessarily in the traditional sense where you're trying to solve a murder mystery or something like that. But I want it to be, even though there's some stuff about the Holocaust in here and things like that, there's some heavy themes, and there's also a lot of arguments. I want all of my books fundamentally to be a fun escape. So I hope that readers enjoy reading them in that way. And then I also, one of the things that I think both of my books so far have been about is forgiveness. And so I also hope that as readers are reading it, that they see that ultimately it's a story about, hope and forgiveness, and how we can learn from the past to improve our future. And also in that way, I think it was really interesting writing this novel because I started it before I was pregnant, but I finished it while I was pregnant. I finished the copy edits on the book like 2 days before my son was born. And so that sort of had me thinking a lot about family. And even before this, I was thinking about it to a certain extent, but with my son, of all the stories I want to be able to tell him in the future about my family, particularly the family that he won't get to meet, and sort of realizing that the older generations of my family, when they were alive, I didn't ask enough questions. And so I think for me anyway, in writing these books, particularly The Imperfects, it's made me want to ask more questions and find out more about my own family. So I would, be really honored if readers felt that way too, and felt inspired to look into their family's past a little bit more.
That's a wonderful thing to do, and what a gift for your son. I think we all wish we would have taken more advantage of the time we had with our grandparents and great-grandparents, even aunts and uncles who have those stories that we don't necessarily have. That's a wonderful gift. I do want to remind some folks that if you'd like to ask Amy a question, you can enter it in the Ask a Question field or over in the chat box on the side of the screen. Now, I do have some questions if you want to do it for a lightning round.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say quickly before that, one of the things I also, while I was working on this novel that I did, was I used Ancestry.com a lot, which I'd never used before. So of course, as long as I was on there, I was like doing a little bit of research of my own family. And it is interesting. I mean, this was one of the things I was really interested in with this book, is kind of exploring what can you know about the past based on what's left behind, and what is kind of forever lost to history if we don't tell stories. But it was very surreal seeing, like immigration papers from my generations of my family in the 20s, and marriage licenses, and various war records and stuff like that tell a lot of stories. I know my dad's grandmother, when she came over, she was Hungarian, but she lied on all the official like census records, it says that she was German because that was like, it was more prestigious then to be a German Jew than a Hungarian Jew. And I just found that so interesting that, you know, the official documents lie about that as well, because she did. And I got to see it on ancestry.com. So that was kind of neat.
That's so interesting. My family on my mother's side, they actually put together a book that has, you know, a lot of my people come from Poland. That's where my nice big face comes from. But they put together this great book that has the name of the boat they came over on, the names of all the children, because there were second marriage, you know, like the part of that lineage. And I found it so interesting. And it was wonderful that my mom lent me that book, because I didn't even know about it till I was probably in my 30s. And it was just amazing to kind of be able to walk it back a little bit and imagine their journey. They're not here to tell it to me, but with those pieces, I could kind of put together the journey they had. You know, it's really something.
And I think most families have that one extended family member that's really interested in researching ancestry. And like my mom's family has a similar book, which I should look at. I haven't looked at yet, probably because she showed it to me in my 20s when I wasn't that interested in family, and should have been. But yeah, I think which is really nice that most families I think have someone who's willing to do that work and wants to do that work, and that's nice for the rest of us that they can share it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, with that, would you like to try the lightning round?
Sure. I've used lightning rounds before, but I've never been on the other end of it. So it'll be
tables
fun.
are now turned, my friend.
Yes.
Okay. So the first one is, do you prefer longhand or keyboard? How do you prefer to write?
Oh, always keyboard. I draft on the computer, and then I print it out and I edit by hand. So I guess both, but keyboard for sure for first drafts.
And what's your favorite word?
I don't honestly know, but I will say that the word I've realized I use too much in my writing, which maybe makes it my like de facto favorite word, is but. So my editor had told me that I've discovered that on my own, but she had told me that every writer sort of has a tick. Like there was another writer that she works with who uses a lot too much, or maybe it was a little, I can't remember. So in both my books I've done, we've made a joke out of it, but what I call the butt draft, where I go through and look at every but and see like, does it need to be there? Because most of them don't. But I guess I like to like compare things. And so in my brain, I create that distinction by using the word but a lot of them, I think I've used but like 20 times in just answering this. So
then what's your least favorite word?
And I wonder if it's showed up in either of my books. I always have really just liked the word pristine. I don't know the way it sounds, and I don't know. I can't give you a reason why. It's just one of those words that I don't like.
And it's hard to choose, but if you could, what would be your favorite book from childhood?
It depends if I'm talking like retrospectively or actually when I was a kid. So I know for now, like the books that I have reconnected to as an adult are like The Westing Game and Bridge to Terabithia, and these books that I'm excited to read with my son. But when I was a kid, I just devoured The Babysitter's Club. I loved it so much.
Isn't there a Netflix series coming out?
I think I heard that.
I don't know if it's up now.
And there was when I was a kid, I had the VHS videos of it. Right. I also had the Babysitter's Club board game. I was in very deep to the Babysitter's Club.
I read those too for sure. I do remember one book specifically from my childhood. It was a large book. It was the Mother Goose fairy tales. I remember it being like black and white checkered, and then the illustrations on the front. And in the bookstore, I've seen that they have that exact. They just are reprinting that, so they have like that exact design, cover design, which is fun.
Yeah, I really
Now,
want to read with my son, but it's hard because he's 8 months. And so when he was
yeah,
little, I would just read to him all the time and pretend that I was like helping shape him into this reader. But now all he wants to do is tear the books. So
right.
it's
He does thick
impossible.
board books.
Yeah, even those, they just end up in his
They'll just,
mouth.
yeah, yeah,
They have these edible, they're like indestructible books now. You
yeah.
probably sell some at your, but
Hmm.
to me, and we let him use them, but there seems something fundamentally wrong to me about having books designed for kids to like eat and tear. And I don't know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Now, is there a book you wish that you would have written?
That's by somebody else.
By somebody else. I'm sorry
Yeah.
about that. Yeah.
Um, Gosh, so many. I think one of the books that actually in a weird way was very helpful with the Imperfects, although it seems totally different, is Away by Amy Bloom. That book, the perspectives in it taught me a lot about writing different characters' perspectives, but it's that book just it's kind of a road trip story in the early 20th century. So it's about this I don't know if you've read it, but it's about this Russian woman who comes to America after her daughter dies. And while she's in New York working, she finds out that her daughter might still be alive in Russia. And so she sets off on this journey across America to go find her daughter in Russia. And it's just, so it's this road trip story. It has so much movement. It has so many characters, but it's just kind of like a pretty flawless book. So I think when I read it, I was like, I wish that I had written this.
Right.
Or I could write like this, I guess.
And what's a guilty pleasure book? Is it 50 Shades?
It's not. I will say I just read Beach Read, which is pretty popular right now.
Okay.
And I hesitate to call it a guilty pleasure. It was a guilty pleasure in that it's like a rom-com and it's not the type of book I usually read, but it was super smart. And a lot of the book is about writing and happy endings. And it made this like really wonderful case for why we need happy endings in stories that felt really relevant right now. But yeah, I think, I don't think anything is really a guilty pleasure read because anything I read, I learn from. But that's probably the most recent one. And I like to listen to to fluffier books,
Sure.
which are a lot of fun.
Me too. Sometimes it's nice to just have something that doesn't require such an intense focus, focus on detail, but you can still enjoy the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and there's something, I mean, I'm really interested as a reader and a writer about those stories. And I think a lot of them do tend to be lighter ones that you just get so invested that you need to know what happens.
Right.
And what that quality is that makes people want more.
And let's see, is there a book you sometimes pretend to have to read when other people are talking about it?
A book that I've pretended to have read that I haven't, Wuthering Heights. I don't know why I haven't read that. I
haven't read it either. It's one of those things you feel like you should have read already, but
I guess that's
hasn't.
it. I mean, yeah, I guess that's it. I feel like, I love Jane Eyre, so I feel like, not the same, but I feel like I'd probably love it. Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte too. But I just haven't read it for some reason.
And I feel like working in a bookstore, there's books that I haven't read that are on my list, and I often feel bad about it because I just haven't read them yet, and I feel like I definitely should have read these by now. I've been in this bookstore for a very long time, but there's so many books. There's piles of books everywhere, so it's hard to get them.
I don't know if it's the case for you, or if it's just now that I'm publishing, I'm more aware of books that are coming out and also meeting a lot of writers. But it seems like there's more of a focus today on reading books just as they're released than there used to be. I feel like when I was younger, I'd read a lot more books that came out like 5 or 6 years ago than I do now. I don't know if that's just me or if that's kind of the
I think you're right. Well, definitely. I think there's so many more books being published now too. There's so many coming out. It is actually very difficult to keep up with what's coming out. and also try to read the classics and try to catch up on things that aren't newly released. That's is definitely a thing for us too. We all, we get the advanced readers copies in the bookstore, and we all have piles of those at home too. We're always reading and always having a to be read pile, and always thinking about books that are coming out, but then classics we want to read. It's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
If you could, speaking of Wuthering Heights, if you could travel back in time, what time period would you travel to?
Oh, I forgot about this question. I think when I was younger, I would have always said like the late 60s, early 70s, just because that seemed like a very magical time to me. Lately, I've been so one of the eras in my new book that I'm focusing on, the wine book, is the mid 50s, and this bohemian society that came about in Santa Barbara, that they used to have these stomp parties where they would celebrate the wine right after it was harvested, and they would stomp it. And I don't know, there's something about that it's like a little bit before, the sort of traditional, more like 60s bohemian that seems really interesting to me right now.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely choose the 60s and 70s too. I would absolutely choose that. There's something about that. It was a turbulent time, but with that, there was some kind of magic that was happening.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are experiencing some of that right now, but it's obviously very, very different as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess maybe I should have said something a long time ago, but it seems like the further back you go, your chance of survival is less.
That's true. And as a woman too,
Yeah.
it's like it'll be rougher the farther back you went. Okay, so if you could have dinner with 3 people, they can be alive and they can also be dead, who would they be?
This one's always a really tough question too. Well, I think lately I would have to say, just in thinking of the imperfects and thinking about family, that I've been really interested lately in my grandmother, who passed away when I was 22. And I didn't know that much about her. So even though I saw her a couple times a year, but she was a really interesting woman. She was a professor in the 40s and 50s, when women weren't really professors, and she lived this very interesting life that I wish now I could ask her questions about, that I literally never asked her anything about. I have no idea if my parents are listening to this or not, so I think I would choose her. I've always really wanted to meet Margaret Atwood. I've seen her speak before, but the idea of having like an intimate dinner with her sounds really nice. And then I'd probably pick somebody. I love to cook. So maybe like Julia Child or someone like that.
Yeah. That sounds good. I always like to think I would choose like Vonnegut and Kerouac and just be this very cool person that I'm not, to be able to have dinner with them,
That sounds like it could be a kind of,
I think it could be
insufferable
a good time.
dinner, maybe.
Yeah, probably with those two. My goodness. My husband was just finishing, he was rereading Big Sur, so we've been talking about Kerouac a lot, and like watching, whenever we're reading something, we're always like watching documentaries on the author and kind of like doing this whole thing with it. So that's been on my mind a lot. But
I will say I loved Kurt Vonnegut when I was in high school. He's one of my absolute favorites.
Yeah. There's this really neat documentary. I'm so sorry, I can't remember who was interviewing him. It was definitely older. It was like from the 70s. And it was just the most interesting conversation I've seen between 2 people, let alone besides this one, an author with another person, in quite a while. It was really, really good. It's terrible. I can't remember who's. I'm like, I don't think it was with Charlie Rose, or someone like that, but it was really, really interesting. Okay, this is the last question. Who is the most influential person in your life that you're not related to?
Oh. Um, hmm. I might say in general, I've been really lucky to have a lot of teachers that really believed in me, starting with my high school English teacher who kind of cultivated not only my love in books, but made me feel like the stories I wanted to tell were interesting and worth telling. And so since then, I've had a lot of other mentors that have been really influential. So I'm going to say a group of people.
All right, and now we're going to go on to some questions. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to enter them into the Ask a Question field or in the chat box. This one, do you see connecting themes in your books that have developed without you realizing it?
I think my first book, I didn't realize a lot of the themes in it in terms of forgiveness and stuff like that until after I had written it. I was doing one of these events and somebody mentioned that I had flowers and gardening in both of my books, which is true. The mother in the Bookshop of Yesterdays is a gardener, and the mother in the Imperfects ends up doing some stuff with flowers towards the end of the book, but there's also mentions of flowers. So that was something completely accidental that I didn't realize. There's often like names. They don't usually make it till the last draft, but I realized in like my third draft that I use the same name in every book. So there's things like that. I don't know. I think anytime you're telling stories about families, there's going to be a lot of similar themes. I think for me, for the Imperfects, the Bookshop of Yesterdays was really the first novel I ever tried to write. And so I learned a lot in the process of writing it. So in the Imperfects, I tried to, I think I had more control over that story. And so I tried to kind of learn from the previous experience and flesh out some of the ideas that I didn't like, especially things like what can we learn about the past based on what's left behind, things like that. I fleshed them out more in my new book. While I think they're just kind of barely touched on in the first one because I didn't realize that was what I was interested in.
Sure. And I forgot to ask you, is there anything you're currently reading right now?
Right now, I just started reading The Vanishing Half along with a lot of other people, which is fantastic. I highly recommend it. So I'm reading that. And then I'm reading a lot of different books about wine right now. And I just finished a book called Shiner by Amy Jo Burns. It's a debut, which I really, really liked.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know her, so I don't know that matters, but I feel like I've been talking about that book a lot, and it's because I genuinely thought it was really fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm talking with her publicist right now. We just started emailing back and forth, so I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, I think she lives in Princeton, so she's not too far.
Yeah.
Not that matters because you're not doing in-store events, but
right. Okay. All right. We have another question. Can you tell us about your writing process, routines, environments, and habits, good or bad?
Sure. Right now I'm learning a lot of bad habits that I don't think I've really had before. In an ideal world, I like to write every morning. So before I had a baby, I was pretty ritualistic about it. I really like to read before I write. So I'll read something that I find, for whatever reason, often the prose like really inspiring. So I like to just kind of wake up slowly and have a cup of coffee and read for half an hour if I have a lot of time. And then when I'm drafting, when I'm writing earlier drafts, I'll sit down and write for about 2 hours. If it's during the school year, when I then have to go teach, that's kind of my day. But if it's in the summer time I have off, I'll take a break in the middle of the day and get some exercise and then do another one of those like 3-hour sessions of reading and then writing in the afternoon. And that's kind of like the dream writing day. When I edit, I can do it for hours. So the editing process is where I really spend long days working. I haven't quite mastered yet a routine with my son, in part because we're all home and we're not getting any help at all right now. Before the sheltering started, I started going to this work play place, which I think is kind of a new thing that's popping up in a lot of cities, where there's like hourly daycare in the front, and then in the back, it's basically a coffee shop where you can sit and do work while, knowing your child is nearby. Yeah, it's fantastic. And what's great about it is that it's a concentrated period of time. So it really forces you to sit down and do the work. And so I guess in terms of bad habits, I think of writing a lot like exercising, where if you haven't done it for a while, it's really hard to get back into it. But once you start doing it, it just kind of becomes a routine, and it gets easier the more you do it. So, I've never really believed in writer's block. I mean, I think that there's certain parts of different stories that are more of a struggle and things like that. But I've always thought, like, you sit down and do the work. And I've always measured that in terms of time rather than pages. So some days sit down for 2 hours and write 2,000 words. And some days I'd sit down for 2 hours and write 300 words. And so that, but either way, it's like sitting down and doing the time. But yeah, that's become progressively more challenging now. And, one of the good things about having written 2 books is that I know I can write another one, but I also know how much work goes into them. So I think so I've been kind of dragging my feet a little bit getting started, because once I really am started, it's so much work. It's fun work, but it's very difficult to write a novel.
Yeah. Goodness. Okay, let's see. Would you consider yourself a planner or a pantser story-wise?
I do a little bit of both. What I learned from my first novel is that you need to know it's, at least for the kinds of stories I want to tell, it's best to know what happens before you sit down to write. So with the Bookshop of Yesterdays, which it's a literary scavenger hunt set in a bookstore, and it's the main character's estranged uncle passes away, and he leaves her his bookstore. And when she goes to retrieve it, she finds these clues that he's left in various books that send her on a journey to talk to people in her family. And so when I started writing, I didn't know. So at the heart of this is an estrangement between a brother and sister, between the main character's mother and her uncle. And when I started writing, I didn't know what caused this estrangement. And in the first few drafts, I still didn't really know what caused the estrangement. So there was a ton of extra work that I ended up having to do because I didn't know what was going to happen in the story. So with the Imperfects, I knew right away, at least chronologically, what the starting point was, right, when the diamond goes missing. But I realized I couldn't sit down to write until I knew the secret at the heart of the story, how the grandmother had the diamond, and whether or not I thought it lawfully belonged to her. So I had to kind of work that out before I got started. So I think in the sweeping sense, I'm a planner, but I don't make outlines. So although for my new book, I'm doing a little bit more outlining just because it has a couple of different time periods. But I do think it's important to leave room for some discovery on the page. I've done a little bit I've tried to do a little bit of screenwriting. And one of the things that I prefer about fiction writing is that with TV or screenwriting, you write an outline first. And so by the time you write when you actually sit down to write the script, everything's already been worked through. So it's really just sort of like punching it in, or it seems that way to me. And so to me, what I didn't love about that was that it took a lot of the discovery out. And so I remember in grad school, one of my professors said, just stay in the scene, like see what happens if you just stay a little bit longer. And I don't always do that, but I think it's a good thing to remember, is that if you keep, especially if it's people who have fraught relationships, if you keep them together for long enough, there's going to be an incident. Yeah. So and that, and to me, letting that kind of happen organically rather than deciding beforehand what a fight is going to be about or where they're going to have disagreements. It's a lot more fun to write, but it also, I think it feels more authentic in the moment too.
Okay. So we have one more question.
Yeah. I feel like people don't ask questions as much in this format, and I love answering questions. So any questions I would ask.
All right. Have you based any of your characters on people that you know?
A lot of my characters are composites of people that I know. So, and like, for instance, I won't say whom, but the character of the mother in The Imperfects of Deborah I borrowed some stories from some different people, but she's what I like imagine one of my friends will be like when she's her age. And I'm not going to say who, because I don't know that the friend would necessarily find that the most flattering. Although Deborah's my favorite character in the book. I love her. But yeah, I think I've never done it where it's just like a character is this person. But the characters are often composites of several people that I know. And I like that sort of borrowing different details from different people. Oh. I guess my parents are not listening to this call because my mom just FaceTimed me.
Okay. I think that is it for the questions, unless another one comes through. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you would like to add?
I don't think so. I guess one thing I'll say is if you do read the book, I'd love to hear what you think. One of the unexpected joys of publishing has been hearing from readers. It actually makes me regret the fact now I will sometimes email writers if I like their books. Like Amy Jo Burns with Shiner, I emailed her and told her how much I liked her book, or I think I emailed her to tell her I was excited to read it. But it never crossed my mind as a reader before, like writers just seem completely inaccessible. And they're actually even really well-known writers are pretty accessible through email. But it just, every time I don't love the emails where people reprimand me for cursing in my books, which happens a surprising amount. I don't know, in my life, when people get mad, they curse. Maybe that doesn't, I try not to be vulgar or anything on the page. But other than that, I really love hearing from readers. It absolutely makes my day. It's still pretty unbelievable to me that my books are published and that people, even people I don't know, are reading them. So it's really exciting. And so if you do read it and you want to tell me what you think, I'd love to know. I also love when readers reach out with stories. So one of the things I've sort of been disappointed about not getting to do a traditional tour is hearing stories that from people in the audience that my book, for whatever reason, it reminds them of. And I was really looking forward to hearing about people's family heirlooms. Because when you start to, and I have a little bit through these kinds of conversations, but I think if I was meeting people in person, there'd be a lot more of those. So if you want to share a family heirloom story with me too, I'd love that.
Okay. Well, I'd like to remind anyone, if you don't yet have your copy of The Imperfects, or you would like to read the Bookshop of Yesterdays, you can click on the Purchase the Author's Books Here button on your screen. It'll take us to the Doylestown Bookshop's website, where we have both of Amy's books listed. We have them in store, so they're available for curbside pickup. You can get it quickly if you live locally, or we'll ship it out to you. Amy, thank you so much for doing this with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Nice talking to you. It was so interesting.
Oh, thanks.
And the best of luck with your new book and the one you're writing too. I can't wait to see that one. I can't wait to see it.
A couple years, unfortunately.
Right. You're a little busy.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you all for coming.
All right. You take care. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.